Good morning, everybody. It is 10 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. A couple of things before we begin. Live captioning is available. Please feel free to, at the bottom toolbar in your Zoom window, turn on captioning if you would like that. And thank you to our captioner, Tiffany. So I'm Daniel McNulty. I'm the director of the Patents Project and super happy to be here in collaboration with the IEP Resource Center this morning to talk about designing instruction that truly is accessible and as universally accessible as possible. So the Patents Project is a statewide network in the state of Indiana that works with all public K-12 schools. And our mission is to support those public schools to create and sustain an equitable learning environment for every student. And we target three main lenses to accomplish that. We look at universal design for learning, or UDL, assistive technology, or AT, and accessible educational materials, which we refer to as AIM. So a little bit about myself. A couple things I like to point out is that I was not always into technology. In fact, I was pretty much against it. As a first-year classroom teacher, I didn't want a computer in my classroom. I didn't want one at my house, and I was very serious about that. And there's a lot of reasoning behind why that changed for me. And obviously that did change for me. And I'll go into that a little bit later. But I just want you to know that you're allowed to not like technology or anything else. And you're perfectly entitled to that opinion. What you're not entitled to is to allow your opinion of something like that to dictate what a student is able to show you they're capable of doing. And there's a big difference between those two things. And we'll talk a little bit more about them as we go. But my background is entirely in special education. Started as a paraprofessional and started a behavioral consulting business for young children on the autism spectrum when I was an undergrad. Worked as a behavioral consultant for just a little while, and then a classroom teacher, and then an assistive technology coordinator for 6 years with Patents, and now 10 or 11 years as the director of the Patents Project.
And I am Marcy Wilburn. I'm the project coordinator with the Indiana IEP Resource Center and excited to be here with Daniel as well. The Indiana IEP Resource Center, for those who are not familiar, really provide training, technical assistance, and resources to teachers across the state. And our main goal is to improve outcomes for students with disabilities, but we're also recognize that when we improve outcomes for disabilities, we can improve outcomes for all students. So we're really looking to provide that training, technical assistance, and resources to improve outcomes for everyone. A little bit about me. I have twin boys who are in kindergarten. My undergrad is from Indiana State University and mild intervention. So I have a K-12 license and then a K-6 license in elementary ed and middle school math. I did my master's in applied behavior analysis from Ball State University, and I'm currently working on my dissertation to earn my PhD at Indiana State University. I love all things travel, especially warm weather and beaches, chocolate, Diet Coke, and as I stated earlier, I'm the project coordinator at the Resource Center. All right, so we want to know a little bit about you today. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mentimeter.com, but we use this as a way for individuals to be able to type their answers in. So you can choose to grab your phone, scan the QR code using the camera, and open up Menti. Or if you're on a desktop or laptop computer, go ahead and go to menti.com and enter the 8-digit code 20822845. And with that, we will be able to see who is joining us today. So we have one other, two others. If you don't mind, if you are an other, if you'll type what that is in the chat for us. One special ed teacher. So Ashley, can you tell me what other you are? What's your current role? One district level admin, SPED teacher, consultants, senior director of student supports. All right, welcome. Special education specialist, assistant principal. Welcome, Tammy. We're glad you're on. All right. Well, that helps us be able to tailor our content to meet your needs. I think it's also important to note that I typed it in the chat as well, but in case you missed it, if you have any questions throughout this session, please feel free to add those. Daniel and I really want to be sure that this session meets your current needs. So of course we have a planned presentation and we're going to go through it, but if at any time there's questions about the content or a specific situation that you might have and want to add to the chat, please feel free to put that in there so that we can address that question as well. It's nice that both of us are on here because we can kind of man the chat and do the slides together. So thank you for sharing your current roles. It's nice to see so many people on here. And it looks like I need to update my Who's Here slide to capture some of those others. So thanks so much for that.
Absolutely great points, Marcy. And we definitely want this to be as interactive as possible. And of course, we've got the slides and we may or may not get through all of them. But if there's something that's more useful to you that you want to go and have us go in the direction of, we're pretty flexible and usually happy to do that as long as it's not too specific to a certain situation that you're working with. And that's awesome, Ashley, that you're in the process of getting your special ed license. Super cool. And Lisa, special ed teacher, K3. That was me, Lisa, the K6 special ed teacher. I like the young ones too.
So the learning objectives for today is really to consider providing equitable access to high quality tier 1 instruction for all students using universal design for learning. We know that when we do what's best for all students, students with disabilities do better and students in the general education population do better. So we're really looking at how can we design for everyone so that everyone can be successful. And then we do have things that we have to do for students with disabilities, and that's that specially designed instruction piece that we're going to cover today as well. So we have stuff today, and we want to make sure that we're using the stuff that we have. So all of the presentation slides are available to you on our Padlet site. So it is here. You can go ahead and go to padlet.com/IEPRC/designing instruction. We also have some handouts and resources that we'll be referencing throughout the session. We just want to make sure that you have access to all of these things as well. If for some reason we talk about something that's not on there, the nice thing about Padlet is we can add it whenever and you will still have access to that as well. So just so that you can kind of see what that looks like, if you didn't click on it at this moment in time, you'll see the presentation slides. We have UDL resources, both from patents and outside organizations like CAS.org. And then the Resource Center has some UDL resources as well. We have some SDI resources and then resources for accommodations and modifications. So those are all available for you to utilize in any way that you see fit for your current position. Share this link with those who are unable to attend today, and they can have access just like you. Sorry, guys, I keep clicking the wrong button.
Padlet, by the way, is a sorry, Marcy.
Oh, fine.
I was going to say Padlet, by the way, is a great tool to use with your students and or your staff. For every staff meeting that I have with my staff, I offer a Padlet as well. It's just another opportunity for people to provide input in a way that may allow them to be anonymous, but it also may allow them to express themselves in a way that's more detailed than if they were to do it verbally in a meeting, with people looking at them. And just a nice thing for you to get access to additional information that's going on in your students' heads or your staff's heads, and is free.
All right, I am currently adding the Padlet link into the chat for you all. Thank you for that suggestion. I appreciate it. And you should be able to get there now. All right, so first let's talk about what does all really mean when we're talking about our classrooms. And it is a focus beyond just our students with disabilities and how are we meeting the needs of all learners within our classroom. So I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to attend Focus on Inclusion last week. I know the weather was a little bit of a damper on that. However, Shelley Moore shares that this is the reality of our current classrooms. And we have students who have all different varying strengths and varying needs that we need to support, and they have opportunities for growth. And when we look at our students, we don't have just our typical learners in the classroom. All of us, teachers, students, instructional assistants, all individuals within the room bring their own unique personalities and their own unique knowledge level, skill level, and skills that they're bringing. So we're all different, whether you have a disability or whether you don't have a disability, We all are different in the ways that we come to the classroom. And I think it's really interesting. This was Shelley Moore's kind of prior to her latest recognition. She now has changed these and making them more individual based, that we are all different. We're not just light blue or we're not just green. She now has kind of looked at the Trivial Pursuit model and kind of made us triangles of different things. So our personality might be this, our culture might be this, the way that we're represented with gender might be this. So we completely represent different facets, and we have so many different types of people and individuals within our classroom, and we need to celebrate the individuals and the diversity within our room. So no longer just thinking of students with disabilities, students without disabilities, it's really looking at the needs of all the learners within our classroom and how we're supporting them. So when we look at this whole child approach, we look at that universal tier 1 model. What are we doing for all kids? And then of course, we're going to have students who aren't successful with what we're doing for everyone and what's in place. And we may have to provide additional supports for those students. And then we're going to have some who need more intensive supports. However, the supports are in specific areas. So let's move to the next slide and really look at the different areas that we're providing supports to students. We don't have students who fall as a tier 1 student or a tier 2 student or a tier 3 student. We have students who have varying strengths and varying needs. So think about yourself for a second, do a little self-reflection, and think of the things that you are really good at. What are the things that you would consider you are an expert in this area or you do really well? And that would be that universal area. You don't need any support or assistance to be successful in those types of things that you need to accomplish. Then go up to the top and think of things that might be more difficult for you. So what are some things that maybe even in your life, you still require various levels of support and people to kind of coach you through and help you through? So for example, for myself, I feel as if when I am writing a paper, that's something that I do really well on. I'm in that universal category. I don't need much support. But if I have to talk to somebody about insurance, whether that be medical insurance, car insurance, any of those things, I have a wonderful brother who's an expert in that, and I have to call him and get his support. So I need more of that intensive support in that area. So we all have varying levels of needs and supports, but we're not classified and stuck to, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. We definitely, it's in the time that we need those supports, we're provided those supports. And when we don't need them, we back off of those supports. So that's how our students are as well. And how are we making sure that we're catering to their needs, but also supporting their strengths that they have? Because students with disabilities have a different status but the same needs. So I'm going to give you a hypothetical here. We have Johnny on the left, and Johnny is a student with a learning disability, and he requires additional supports to be successful in reading. And then on the right, we have Billy, and Billy is a student who is not eligible to receive services. However, he still struggles with reading and still needs additional support. So they have a different status. One has an IEP, one does not, but they both need support in reading in order to be successful. So they have a similar need or is the same need. So when we talk about status and need, students with a disability who are eligible to receive services have a legal obligation to receive those services. Students who struggle and have a need but are not eligible to receive service, we have a moral obligation to serve those students. So we need to make sure we're looking at what are we doing, what's best for all, and making sure that, just special education students can receive this service, or just students who are participating in MTSS or RTI tiers can receive this service. How are we making sure we utilize our resources best so that all students can be successful? So different status, same need, but we're obligated to serve both of them. So students with disabilities don't have special needs, but they do have special rights. All students have varying level of needs that we need to support. All right, Daniel.
So how do we do that? That sounds like a really difficult task. And if you're here, you've probably realized how difficult that task is. So we don't have a magic potion to give you, but we have definitely some important strategies and tools to offer that will point you in the right direction. And I think a big thing to remember is, because this is maybe where it's going to start to get a little bit overwhelming potentially, to remember to take small bites and change one small thing tomorrow and see how it goes. Take data on it, reflect on it, and then adjust it a little bit and maybe change one other small thing next week and take it in small bite-sized chunks. It doesn't have to be something completely different either. It just has to be a change to one of the ways that we present information, how we get information back from students, and how we engage students. So we're going to talk about that a lot more. So over the course of working with public schools in Indiana for the past 16 years, I've seen a lot of things work and I've seen a lot of things not work. And I've kind of boiled it down to this one statement that really determines whether or not things are going to work. And are you willing, permitted, and able to teach differently, not just teach with different tools? And that's an important, really important thing for someone like myself to say, who is the director of an assistive technology project. It's not always just about the tools. In fact, it's almost never just about the tools. And it's about being willing, permitted, and able to teach differently, which might involve those tools. It also might not. The willing part has to do with culture and attitude, and that has to do with people. And by nature, that's a slow and difficult change to make. So just know that up front. The permitted part has to do with policies and procedures and protocols. Those, although sometimes a pain to change, are easier to change and definitely influence the willing part, the culture part. And so that permitted part really hit me as being super important. The summer of 2009, I believe it was, or 2010, when the iPad was first introduced. So in January, that iPad was introduced, and I was actually presenting at another conference, and I got an email instantly as soon as the iPad was released from a school district in Indiana. And they said, hey, we want you to come in July this summer and train all of our staff on iPads. We're buying 88 of them. And I thought, well, cool, but I haven't even seen an iPad yet in person, but I'll figure it out. I said, sure, I'll do that in July. Showed up in July. And by that time, figured it out, was ready to do some basic training with them, and walked in, and above the room that we were training in, there was two signs. One said they had a 95% attendance rate goal. I thought, that's cool. The other sign said, no devices. And it had a big circle with a line through it, and it listed all the devices that were not allowed. One of the devices that was listed first was iPads. So simultaneously to somebody purchasing 88 iPads in the district, somebody else in the same district was developing a policy that said no iPads. And they said, yeah, that's no big deal. The right hand didn't know what the left hand was. And I said, no. I said, this is not okay, because what that policy does is allows all of the people in this room with their iPads still wrapped in plastic in their boxes, who don't want to use it to teach, to maintain that attitude. It's not changing the culture and the willing part. So that's how those two things are linked. The able part is super easy to change. Those are your skills. And we can change those through stuff like this by coming to the IEP Center and Patents and Googling things and YouTube. And the skills part is easy. The being willing to take whatever it is you're doing and teach in a different way, not just slapping an iPad on top of it, is the tricky part. So to put that in real concrete terms, taking a picture of a worksheet that we've used for 5 years or 10 years with my iPad is not using that tool in a different way. It's not teaching differently. It's using a different tool to use the same thing we've done for 10 or 15 years. Okay, we can go on. So that sort of sets up the philosophy that I have and that the Patents Project has about a lot of things related to universal design for learning. And when we compare that to specifically design, especially design instruction, they work really well together, but there's also some big differences. Marcy, do you want to talk about SDI a little bit?
Yeah, so we'll get into this later in the slides a little bit more deeply, but specially designed instruction is what makes special education special. And it is what is required by law. So it is what the teacher is doing to instruct the student. And it is how we are meeting the specific needs of the student that we are working with. And we're really taking the instruction that's available and making it work for the specific individual, whereas that's different than what universal design for learning is. So go ahead, Daniel.
Sure, that was perfect timing because my Alexa device just started playing motivational yoga music right when you said it. Just had enough time to pause her. So yeah, that's a great explanation. And Marcy describes SDI really well. And the key there for me is that SDI, that's what the teacher is going to do. That's what the adults are going to do, not the student. Universal design for learning think about UDL in terms of being proactive. It's not specific to a student. So imagine no student faces. You don't know who's on your roster yet, and your job is still to design things to be as accessible as possible. That's universal design. So it's building a building that's accessible without having to add a ramp on later. It's building the doorway is wide enough, the doors light enough, tables that can accommodate somebody who's going to sit in a chair, somebody who's going to sit in a wheelchair, or somebody who's going to stand. Designing ahead of time without necessarily knowing anybody who's going to walk into your classroom, whether it be a concrete brick and mortar classroom or a virtual classroom. Which is pretty much represented by this. And you've probably seen this cartoon. If you haven't, it's probably one you want to tuck away and use again when you talk to other people about what universal design for learning is. And even when you talk about assistive technology. So this is a cartoon with a bunch of students out front of a building it's snow. There's steps covered in snow. There's a ramp covered in snow. And there's this one student in a wheelchair and 6 students who are not in wheelchairs and one adult who's shoveling. And the student in the wheelchair says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" The adult who's shoveling says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." And this kid in the wheelchair says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." Right? Because there's only one way to get up steps, but I can roll up a ramp. I can cartwheel up a ramp. I can walk up a ramp. I can somersault up a ramp. I can breakdance up a ramp. Well, I can't breakdance up a ramp, but Marcy can. And this really represents, to me, not just universal design for learning, but assistive technology. And I'll talk a little bit about why. So if this building had been just had the ramp shoveled, that would be universal design and that everybody could use it. But the fact that this ramp had to be added on to these stairs after the stairs were built is sort of assistive technology. Which isn't a bad thing. It's a great thing that they added on a ramp. But the fact that the building wasn't designed from the ground up with a ramp instead of stairs separates it from being universally designed, if that makes sense.
All right, so at this time, we're going to show a Shelley Moore video, Reducing the Barriers, Planning for All. And I think she does a really great job of helping us think about the barriers that students might have, whether they're students with disabilities or without disabilities, and how we can think to plan and design our lessons to best fit all of the needs of our learners.
Welcome to 5 More Minutes, useful videos in about 5 minutes that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore, and today's episode is called Reducing the Barriers, Planning for All. Okay, everyone, today we're talking about something very important. Today we're talking about shifting a paradigm. Now, one thing that I'm not sure everybody realizes is that in our efforts to move towards more inclusion and equity in our schools is that one of the biggest barriers is the actual infrastructure of the existing educational model. You see, me, like many of us who work in education, we were taught how to support students through a special education lens. That is, a model where a plan is made for most students and then special support is offered to those students who don't have success in that original plan. This special support then seeks to figure out, well, what's wrong with the student in question, and then offers support in a way by offering adaptations and modifications so that they can fit into the first plan. But what if nobody fits into the plan? Because of how we were all taught to support students, as our classrooms have become more diverse, there's been this overwhelming feeling that inclusion is so much work because more and more students need this type of retrofit support in order to be successful. Okay, now listen, I have never met a teacher that can follow more than one plan. So a big question emerging here is, how do we make one plan for all learners from the start so that we can be effective and efficient and then not have to retrofit for all of the learners that don't fit? In order to do this, we need to shift how we think about and respond to students who are struggling. You see, special education evolved out of a medical model. So for example, like if you break your leg, you go to the doctor and then they fix you. And if they can't fix you, they send you to a specialist. We get medical attention when something is wrong. This is special education education. It's designed to react to students when something is wrong. And as a result, our educational system has become so heavily reliant on processes that emphasize failure, expensive evaluations, and intervention systems that focus on the deficits in students. Well, something that we can learn from the disability community is that just because a person is struggling doesn't mean they're broken. People don't need to be fixed. So then how do we respond to students in a way that meets their needs without creating programs and following processes for only targets what's wrong? Well, I will tell you this. We need to move away from the medical model, that's for sure. So what can we do instead? Well, one alternative is to shift towards a social model. In a social model, if someone isn't having success, it's not because they have a disability or because something's wrong with them as an individual, but instead it's because there's something around them in the context that's limiting their success. Now listen, I spend a lot of time traveling, mostly throughout North America, but about 2 years ago I had the opportunity to speak at a conference in Hong Kong. Now I was so excited about this. I've never been to Hong Kong, so my wife and I, we packed our bags and we were ready to go on our great Hong Kong adventure. Well, I was so excited that I didn't really anticipate that I would have different needs in Hong Kong than I do in North America. Typically, I would feel pretty independent in my travels. I would rent a car, I would drive, no problem. I would be able to navigate conversations and menus and directions and be able to find the conference hall that I'm presenting in, easy peasy. But in Hong Kong, I realized I needed much more support to be able to do these very similar things. Like I wasn't able to rent a car, I didn't have the right driver's license. I wasn't able to have many conversations, read menus, or follow directions because there was a language barrier. I also had no idea where I was speaking because I couldn't read any of the conference signs. I needed a lot of support in Hong Kong. Thank goodness the organization who brought me there anticipated this and made 3 Hong Kong EAs available to me if I needed them. I had a driver, I had a translator, I had a host. But I couldn't help think to myself, like, that's so many resources for one person. What's important to know about this example is that whether I'm in North America or whether I'm in Hong Kong, I'm still the same person. My success and independence in Hong Kong had very little to do with me as an individual and had more to do with the barriers that existed around me. Now, I want you to imagine all the students that you work with, every teacher they interact with, every classroom and school they go to. I want you to think about all these different contexts as possible different countries. Students are the same regardless of where they go. What changes is the context around them, and every context is going to have more or less barriers that can either support or limit success. So how do we support kids this way? Well, first of all, we have to anticipate these barriers, which means we can't wait for students to not be successful. We can't wait for them to fail. Second, we have to stop putting all of our resources into trying to fix individuals. If we move away from this kind of student diagnosis and intervention as the first strategy, it allows us to assess the environment and the context first to find out what's getting in the way. Because the big idea here is this, my friends. The more we support a context to reduce barriers, the less individual resources a person will need to be successful. The social model of support is a foundational understanding to planning for all students and directly connects to universal design for learning, response to instruction, and collaborative models of support. It would be very difficult to try and implement any of these frameworks if we were only looking at students through a medical and deficit-based perspective. Students are not broken. They may need support, but today's challenge is asking, instead, look around a student to see how can we fix the context so that barriers are reduced instead of looking at what we can do to fix the students in their deficit area. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of 5 More Minutes. Make sure you take a look at the 5 More Minutes podcast where we dig deeper into some of these big ideas. Give us a like. Don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss any of these episodes. I'll see you next time. Welcome to 5 More Minutes.
If you aren't currently subscribing to Shelly Moore's 5 More Minutes, I encourage you to do so. I think she definitely challenges our current belief system and helps us think a little bit differently. We are still very set in the medical model for special education, but thinking about planning around the barriers for students will really help you design universally for all learners. And so how can you think of what the barriers are and how do we get around those barriers and make sure that students can be successful and access the curriculum without having the hindrance of those barriers being in place? So again, I think she's very forward thinking And we're not necessarily all there, but she's definitely in a place that I strive to be in thinking about inclusion and access for all. And I think that it's great for you to hear that message as well. All right, Daniel.
Yeah, awesome. And so UDL is a framework, and that's really what I want you to keep in mind, that it's a framework full of choice and flexibility versus a scripted curriculum or a scripted anything. So it's not a specific set of steps. It's not a procedure thing or a protocol. It's a framework for how you think about delivering and receiving information to learners. So it's a framework full of choice and flexibility that's based on three principles: how we provide information to our learners in multiple and flexible ways, how we get responses back from our learners in multiple and flexible ways, how we let them play with that in their heads in multiple and flexible ways, and how we engage our learners in multiple and flexible ways. Oh, I jumped ahead a little bit. But the great part about this slide is that it's a visual representation of side profiles of human heads with different parts of the brain highlighted for each of those three bullet points that I mentioned that make up universal design for learning. Multiple means of engagement happens in one part of the brain. Multiple means of representation happens in another part of the brain, and that's how we present information to learners. And multiple means of action or expression and how learners play with it in their minds and respond to it to demonstrate their understanding happens in a third part of the brain.
Daniel, we had a session last night with Paula Kluth, who did an intro to universal design for learning for our new educators across the state. And one of the things that she said that I really held on to was she talked about multiple means of representation is really kind of that teacher role and what the teacher's doing. Multiple means of action and expression is really how the students are showing what they know, so the student part. And then she said multiple means of engagement is really kind of meeting in the middle and letting the teacher engage students differently and letting the students say, hey, this is what engages me. And I really liked that kind of way to put that in perspective a little bit.
I like that a lot too. I'm glad you added that. And I also wanted to point out, and I almost forgot, that multiple means of engagement is the first bullet point here. It actually used to be the last bullet point years ago, and not a whole lot of people know that. But Patents has been doing UDL in the state since 2002. And it used to be the last bullet point, and they made a big effort to make it the first bullet point, which is kind of obvious, but I like to point out why. The other two bullet points don't really matter a whole lot if you don't have engagement. And I think that Paula's way of putting that, Marcy, is cool, that it's a meeting of in the middle between the teacher and the student. And I also think that's the most difficult bullet point, not only because the other two are dependent on it, but we have 25, 30, 40 kids in the same space, all coming from different backgrounds with different cultural experiences and different background knowledge on whatever it is the lesson we're working on. That's a difficult task to engage all 25 or 30 of those students in multiple flexible ways. I think the most difficult because it's the most abstract. The other two here have concreteness to them. We can see, hear, feel, sense them happening or not happening. It's more empirical in nature. Multiple means of engagement is really abstract and philosophical almost. And so we get a lot of questions about, well, how do we do that in multiple flexible ways? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But one thing I can tell you for sure that almost always increases engagement is offering choice and being flexible with all things. So an example of that is if I say, okay, everybody turn to your social studies chapter or your social studies textbook to page 27, there might be one or two or three students in there who are engaged by that, but most are probably not going to be as engaged by that as if I said something like, okay, you can turn to page 27 in your book, or here's the URL or the QR code to go to this website, or here's this video you can watch. You have these three choices, and in 10 minutes, we're going to regroup and discuss. Just offering the choice of how to receive that information is already more engaging. So all three of these are linked. And I think this first bullet point, recognizing our students' internal and external strengths, weaknesses, and needs, really speaks to, well, all three bullet points, but definitely that first bullet point of engagement. And realizing these things and meeting them where they are is most certainly going to be more engaging than not. And a good example of that is the gaming world, video games. And so I've never really been a gamer, but I'm very interested in it because we know that a good video game can captivate a student for 14 hours, and we can't captivate that student in class sometimes for 14 seconds. And so I'm very interested in the reasons why. And I think one of them is that video games tend to meet the players or the learners where they are. And so it's no fun to play a game that's way too easy. It's also no fun to play a game that's way too hard. Meeting that student where they are and allowing them to learn from their failures in that game so that they can progress and be better is incredibly engaging. The environment is another piece of that. So not just meeting the students where they are with their strengths and weaknesses and needs, but also the physical environment. There's a lot of aspects related to designing that environment as universally as possible to maximize opportunities to not just succeed, but before we get to success, to access the learning materials and the environment itself, which of course will lead to more success than not having access. Oh, I also want to say one other thing. Marcy, can you go back to the previous slide just real quick?
Sure.
I did something on this slide and a couple of the other slides, and I meant to talk about why I did it, and I forgot. So I want to mention it now. I described what's going on in this slide verbally, and I did it on a couple other slides. At the snow shoveling slide, I described that verbally. And I did that for the purpose of, I don't know who's here and I don't know who can't see or can't see the slides well. And so if I don't do that, I'm effectively excluding people who can't see those slides from this information, which isn't fair to anyone. And I hope it's a model of something that we should be doing all the time in every meeting, in every classroom situation, wherever we are, in every training, is providing that information in multiple and flexible ways.
Yeah, and I think that's such an easy thing, but we're not in practice of doing that. So it's easily overlooked and doesn't typically happen in a classroom.
I think that's exactly right. And I also think we sometimes have this feeling that nobody really wants me to describe this slide. They can see it for themselves, and they're going to be offended if they're going to feel like I am having to describe it to them. So I just want to ask: was anyone here offended that I described either of those pictures verbally? Angela,
Yes or
your
no in
hand.
the chat will help us. Susan says no. I think the consensus so far is no.
Good. I never had anybody, and I try to ask that question, and I have for years, and I've never had anybody said, "Yeah, I wish you didn't do that." Same thing goes with captions, and obviously, captions are something that are required by somebody who can't hear what's happening auditorily, but they're beneficial to everyone else too. Sometimes they take a little bit of getting used to if you're not used to seeing captions on everything, but once you are used to seeing them, you feel naked without them. It's like, you leave the house without your watch that you're used to wearing all the time. It's like, where are the captions? And I'm used to seeing those, relying on those, because it does provide information to us, again, in another way. It also counts as time spent reading. So once I point out the captions to people, I watch all their eyes, and they immediately start reading everything that's being captioned and looking for mistakes. And but then they realize, okay, I can go back to this. If I wasn't quite paying attention, I can look back at the captions from a few seconds ago and not be lost. So they're beneficial to everybody. Okay. So how about you guys? And nobody said they were offended, so I'm glad about that. You as a learner. If you, and I know Angela found her Zoom hand maybe by accident, but if you can find your Zoom hand and raise your Zoom hand, if you think your students, or if you don't have students, you have staff, if your staff or students strictly learn best by watching. I don't see any hands. How about if they strictly learn best by reading? Still no hands. What about by hearing information? No. How about by doing? Hands on. We got some hands there. How about through multiple modalities? Here we should see some hands. There we go. And this is a really great slide for that purpose because, for years and years, we've heard all of these push and emphasis towards learning styles. And the idea that we all have different ways of receiving and interacting with information best isn't a bad thing by default. But by saying something like, you're a watcher, you're a reader, you're a doer, you're kinesthetic, you're this or that, and that's what you'll always be, is incredibly limiting to learners. And I wonder how you would define yourself as, which one of these. And I'm guessing if you're like me, it would depend on the task. It would depend on the setting and the situation. And, in general, I like to probably think I learn best by actually doing it myself a few times and even failing at it and looking at it and touching it and doing it again and again. But when I think about all the different things that I want to learn, it's not always through doing. Sometimes it's through these other things as well. Did you want to add anything to that, Marcy?
No, I mean, I think we sometimes we tend to go with learning styles, but the research actually on that is completely outdated. So I love that Daniel said that it was limiting, because we don't want people to think, oh, well, I am only a kinesthetic learner. I am only a visual learner. It depends on what we're doing, the type of learning that works best for us. But the part of universal design for learning that I love the most is we are teaching students to be expert learners and learn what modality works best for them for various tasks. And that's something that they need to learn over time so that they can become self-advocates for themselves and say, oh, I really need this in this format to learn best for me. And then how great of a thing to be able to talk to their teachers about what works for them and being able to provide that. So it's really creating those expert learners for our students.
Yeah, and another great point to add on to that is that until students have the opportunity to experience different ways of receiving and interacting with information, they truly don't know, and you don't know how they learn best. And so that requires some time and explicit instruction on something they've never done before. So if it's reading some content with their ears versus reading it with their eyes, or reading it with their hands, in Braille, that requires some specific instruction and time with that student to play with that, to learn it before you're able to say whether or not that's a good modality for that student to respond with or to interact with the content with. Okay. So intentionally customized design is really what we're talking about here. We're talking about the physical space, ways to engage learners, options for presenting content, and flexibility for them to show us what they know, as we've talked about those 3 bullet points. And I like that this slide sort of expands that into a fourth bullet point of the classroom environment, because that's the physical environment itself, which is incredibly important, but it's also the cultural environment. And so if there's a classroom environment set up where students feel supported and encouraged and safe to take learning risks, that's already a way more engaging classroom environment that doesn't have a lot to do with the physical space itself, but what the teacher does and says. And so the best teachers I've ever observed in classrooms absolutely support their students in that way, and it's a safe environment for them to respond in. And what I mean by that is, the teacher makes it very clear that there will be no ridicule, no bullying, and that we're a family here. We take care of each other. We're a team. And so that adds to the safety feeling there, but also there's multiple ways to respond. So a student who's had a history of less success and maybe being ridiculed and failure after failure is really probably pretty unlikely to put their hand up in class and take another chance at that. And so until they learn to trust that environment and that it's not going to happen in this classroom, and that teacher and these classmates of mine are all on my team and protect me, having multiple ways. So allowing them to respond on something like a Padlet, where they don't have to put their hand up in class, allowing them to respond on something like Menti or like Poll Everywhere or something like that. Yeah, Marcy's got a great comment in there. Do you want to expand on the idea of failure?
Yeah, just that we have to teach students that getting it wrong is okay. And that's how we learn. We learn from our mistakes. And as long as we persevere and keep going, but we have to create that culture within our classroom. It's not the, oh, you're wrong, shoot you down, and you don't get to try again or answer again. We have to motivate kids to try again. And teach them to self-motivate so that they continue that when things get hard in the future. Another thing I was going to add is just when we create that safe space, like Menti and different ways to respond. Another way is, that think, pair, share, square type of situation where they have time to think about it. And then they have time to kind of gauge with one peer, whether they are accurate or not. And they can change their answer and modify their answer and then share with another pair to make a square, just so that it is a little bit more safe when you are doing it with a small group as opposed to the whole environment. Plus, it creates more opportunities to respond for all students. And when kids are responding and engaged in the content, they're going to do better and perform better.
Absolutely. So real quick, one of my favorite quotes is from a presenter, an adult named Daniel Kish, and he is blind. He went completely blind at around age 5 or 6, I believe. And he uses his mouth, his tongue, to make a clicking sound, and he listens for the echoes, and he sort of echolocates himself in an environment like a dolphin or a bat does, which is pretty cool. And I hung out with him for an evening in downtown Indianapolis, and I'll be honest, at first I was kind of like, I don't know if I want to just let him cross the street by himself. And he's like, I got this. I'm like, all right, I got to practice what I preach. And he totally had it. He tells a story that his dad brought him home a bicycle when he was very young. And he just says, I'm most thankful for my parents allowing me to ride that bicycle, even though I was blind. And the neighbors all thought they were crazy. And he said it hurts to crash into a light post or a mailbox, but it's completely devastating to be denied the opportunity to crash into a light post or a mailbox. And I've never forgot that sentence out of his mouth. And I try to do that with people I work with and offer the opportunity to fail in a way that's supported, in a way that we can learn from it. And Daniel Kish, by the way, now teaches other blind adults to ride bicycles, and he leads tour groups through national parks. And that's because somebody wasn't afraid to allow him the opportunity to fail. Okay. So Marcy alluded to this a little bit, but I want us to think about our current environment and what it's made up of, and the sounds and the things that are happening in that environment, what the seating is like, how it feels, how our other senses are interacting. Is there a smell? Those sorts of things. Start to think along those lines. And then I think the next slide is a picture, right, Marcy? Yeah. So let's look at this classroom, and I'll describe it. And then I want you to kind of put into the chat window some things that you think are either universally designed or not universally designed. So it looks like a fairly typical classroom, except there's some big windows on the far side in the corner, 3 big windows that are almost full length from ceiling to floor. There's 2 circular tables and a rectangular table. There's a seating area in the middle that's like a coffee table with benches on either side of it. At one of the circular tables, there's 4 exercise balls or therapy balls. And there at the other circular table, it looks like there's 2 different kinds of seats. One's kind of a lounger, and the other 2 are sort of like camping chairs. There's a couch. Jill says flexible seating. Yeah, absolutely. Flexible seating is definitely a sign of universal design. Susan loves the seating too. Various seating. What else? Anything besides the seating? We 100% agree with the seating being flexible. Materials are accessible for everyone? Maybe. I don't know for sure, because I don't really see a whole lot of materials. I see some books on a bookshelf. There does seem to be a lot of space in between furniture, which is awesome for someone who is maybe getting around in a wheelchair or with crutches. It does look like it's set up for group work, Lisa, which is, we tend to think of as a good thing, but we definitely have some students who prefer solo work. And not that we should always let them do solo work, because being able to work in a group is important, right? But I'm not sure there's a whole lot of space. Oh, I do see chairs over by the wall that could be for more individualized, I want to be by myself for a little while. And there's really no right or wrong answers here. We're just kind of thinking through this and what makes up a good universally designed environment. So the lighting, I didn't mention the lighting, but it looks like there's traditional fluorescent lights overhead that are turned on. But because of those three big windows in the corner, I almost think this is a classroom that could have those lights turned off or partially turned off, maybe as an option. Fluorescent lights, I'm sure most of us probably know, actually flicker all the time, even though most of us can't see it. Some people can see that flickering and it drives them crazy and actually causes extreme fatigue and inability to do their best mental performance. I don't see a whole lot of decorations, which is a good thing. Probably the best classroom I've ever been in had the teacher who told me anything that's up on the walls or hanging from the ceiling is two things. One, it's created by the students, not by me, or not purchased. And two, it has to do with whatever it is the unit or the lesson is that we're working on currently. And I thought that's awesome. Like those are meaningful decorations. All right. Anybody got anything else they want to add? So let's talk about engagement a little bit. And you can just type this one. Do you want to type this one in the chat window, Marcy, or have them do Menti?
Sure, that's fine. We can do chat window. It'll be a little bit faster based on our time.
Yeah, I think that's good. So in the chat window, how are you currently engaging your students or your staff if you don't have students? Making it relevant, absolutely. Multisensory. Lisa, can you expand on that multisensory idea at all? Or an example? What do you mean by that? Jill has the option for hands-on with students. Tammy says our staff have been diving into neuroscience and how to use those techniques with middle schoolers. Very cool. We noticed more engagement when they take breaks. I'm glad you said that, Tammy. That's a really great point. And I know we're pushing your limits today with an hour and a half, but we got so much to say. We're not going to give you much of a break, but we try to make it interactive, which hopefully is a little bit of a break. And those breaks, the length of those breaks and the frequency of those breaks has to do primarily with the age of the student, which changes drastically as they get younger or as they get older, either way. Allowing students options on how they complete the assignment. That's awesome, Shannon. That is universal design. What kinds of options do they have? I'm just curious. Susan says relationships first. So that's engagement, right? Definitely no learner is going to be engaged in what you're doing if they have no relationship whatsoever with you. Breaks offering different options such as typing or writing. Students hear the info, see the information, experience it hands-on, taste or smell, or engage in movement. They tend to learn easier. I would agree with all of that. So Susan, back to your comment on typing and writing. I'll just tell a real quick story about myself. If you've ever heard me present before, you've probably heard this story before, so I'll do a quick version of it. But I, growing up, hated to handwrite with a pencil and paper. And so every report card I got from kindergarten through like 8th grade and every parent teacher conference my parents attended, there was always two comments that were on every single one. One was his handwriting's terrible. He needs a lot of work on his handwriting. We can't read anything he writes and he loses points because we can't read it. And the other was he's really shy. He doesn't put his hand up and talk in class. He doesn't seem to want to, we think he knows all the answers. He just doesn't want to share them in class. And so I look back now and I think those two comments that all of my teachers, kindergarten through 8th grade, thought were most important to put on my report card are the two things that are least relevant to my success as a professional adult, because I speak for a living and I haven't handwritten a darn thing in probably 25 years. And I didn't realize this until actually just maybe 5 years ago. It's the sound and the feel of a wooden pencil on paper that I can't stand. It's worse than fingernails on a chalkboard. And so of course I avoided doing it and got it done as quickly as I could and avoided practicing. Um, and all it would have taken to get more of what was going on in my head out for my teachers was to give me a pen instead of a pencil, or to give me a keyboard. Not that we had keyboards that long ago, but now that's a great option. So I'm glad you said that, Susan. So let's talk about multiple means of engagement. We already talked about that happening in one part of the brain, the affective network of the brain. And this is based in brain science, by the way. That's not just Marcy and I saying this is really cool stuff and putting up little drawings of people's heads. This is based in brain science. And so some strategies for engagement. We talked about closed captioning. Having captions on all the time for anything that you're doing is a great idea for engagement. It offers that multisensory approach. So you've got the information coming to you verbally or auditorily, but also through text. It also counts as time spent reading. So as you're reading that with your eyes and also hearing it with your ears, that's just like, or not just like, but very similar to text to speech, or to a teacher reading to a student, or a peer reading to a peer. It counts as interaction with text. And we know that time spent reading is the greatest predictor of reading growth. Google Translate, also closely related to that, also free. And so, by the way, I should have said that about captioning. So captioning, automatic captioning is built into Google Slides. It is built into Microsoft PowerPoint. It is built into Zoom. It's pretty much built into everything now. And it's gotten pretty good. It's not perfect. It's definitely not as good as what we have right now with a live captioner. But it takes like 2 clicks to do. And it definitely is better than nothing as far as including more people in your content. Okay. Some more methods for engagement and strategies. We've talked about a few of these already, but choices in seating. And I present that to adults like, I ask them where they do their best work. And is it always in the same place? Is it always in the same desk with your knees, hips, and ankles at 90 degrees? Or is it sometimes at that desk, sometimes at the kitchen counter, sometimes in the garage, sometimes while you're taking your morning shower or making your morning coffee? We do our best mental thinking in different places. It's not always the same. For most of us. For some people, they're like, yep, it's always at that desk. When I leave that desk, I turn it off. But the point there is that a student may today want to sit in a traditional desk, and it's going to depend on the task as well, and the supports that I need, and maybe how close I need to be to you physically as the teacher to get support. And tomorrow I might be able to just sit on the floor or lay on the floor. And what I tell teachers is that if you're not measuring how long and whether a student can sit in a traditional desk with 90-degree hips, knees, and ankles, then it really doesn't matter where they're doing the tasks that you are measuring. Okay, so some varied methods for response we've already talked about. And then Marcy alluded to this. Why is the content relevant to your students? Did you want to say anything else about that, Marcy?
I was just responding to Christine and wanted to make sure I was up to the slides for you. So you keep going.
Okay, no problem. Relevant content, super important. And I can tell you for sure that students who are working on content that's not relevant to their real life are definitely going to be less engaged, if engaged at all. As the choice built in, we've talked quite a bit about that. Has the teacher set it up to be a safe culture, a safe environment in that classroom, to be able to take learning risks and see failures as opportunities to learn, not as opportunities to further divide you and exclude you from the rest of the group. Yeah, and do they have the necessary skills? So it doesn't have to be easy. It doesn't have to be something that they're going to have guaranteed success. We want to have high expectations, but do they have the necessary foundations to be able to work hard and experience success? And not only the necessary skills to be able to work through a task, but the necessary tools to be able to work through a task. So for example, if a student is not phonetically decoding yet, but they're able to comprehend content that's 6th grade levels above, forcing them to decode before they can have a conversation about the solar system is excluding them from that content, as an example. Thanks, Christine. I hope you have a good day. Few others, tools and strategies for engagement. Voki are sort of avatars that you can program to say whatever you want them to say, and which sounds kind of silly, but for some students, there's a big difference in the stimulus of this avatar speaking to them as opposed to their teacher speaking to them and having them do something or asking them a question. Apple Clips is a app that is free on all iOS or Apple devices. And what's really cool about Apple Clips is it's a movie app that allows you to create movies. But what's really cool and different about it is that it does automatic captions as you're recording the video, which is super cool. So you don't have to do any extra work to caption that later. And it's pretty good. It's not 100% accurate, but it's pretty good. And you guys talked about some of these other bullet points already. Get to know your students and make the content relevant. Develop those relationships with them. And again, turn on those captions. All right, we can keep going. Any ideas after we've discussed that, how you might increase student engagement or staff engagement if you have staff? Yeah, and while you guys are typing stuff in there, I'll add that I've actually lost count of the number of times that people have come up to me after a presentation, and maybe they walked in late and they're stuck in the back of the room, and they have come up and said things like, "I'm so glad you just had the captions on, and I didn't have to like get your attention to have you turn them on because I have a hearing impairment and I wouldn't have been able to hear anything you were saying." And so I just always on. Every staff meeting, every training, everything we do, captions always on. And I'll add to that, my staff and I are in the habit of calling each other out when we are doing something, even if it's just an informal little meeting. We say, "Hey, can you turn the captions on?" Lisa says the virtual reality would probably be a big hit. Yeah, definitely. With some students, I'll say. With others, they're like, I have enough issues in my real life. I don't need a virtual life as well." And I say that because I've had students tell me that.
Are there any questions at this time that anybody has? Oh, I'm going to pass that one off to Daniel. What are your thoughts on the use of YouTube, Daniel?
I'll tell you my thoughts for sure, but I'll add a little response to that. What use of YouTube for what? And while you're typing that out, I'll go ahead and answer it. I say yes, absolutely. In fact, I'm pretty much anti-filtering in every regard. And here's why. And I know that makes people nervous sometimes, but here's why. I think when we are in the habit of treating the K-12 space as this different world, it's really difficult for us to be able to say we're preparing those students to go out into the real world. And so when we block everything that is potentially offensive, for example, in the K-12 environment, instead of teaching how to be appropriate and responsible in the K-12 environment, we really can't be surprised when they leave the K-12 environment and access those things on their own. I have a student who needs to hear books and watch videos, but our school locks down YouTube for all students, and so many students abuse it. So a lot of students also abuse pencils. They stab kids in legs with pencils. I've seen students walk into schools and take their shoes off and throw them at other students' faces. We don't block shoes. We don't block pencils. We deal with that situation with that kid who did it, and we teach appropriate behavior for those tools. So I mean, that's kind of a gross over exaggeration a little bit, but the same concept applies. So one kid does something bad, or 10 kids or 100 kids do something that's inappropriate with YouTube. So we block that for all students. And like you said, you've got a student who absolutely needs it. So I would encourage you to reach out, Susan, and we can maybe find some ways to get that student what he or she needs in other ways. But to answer your question on that philosophical level, I think that, blocking everything for everyone because somebody abused something is almost always the wrong answer. Yeah, Marcy put that much more eloquently. Teach digital citizenship. So how do you currently present information? Go ahead, Marcy.
Yeah, just go ahead and add this to the chat again based on time. Let's go ahead and just, how is the teacher representing the information or sharing that curriculum with students?
And several of you already answered that. You said you present it multiple ways, multi-sensory. But if you got anything else to add there, please do.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So multiple means of presenting information to your learners. We've talked about this quite a bit. It could be verbal, it could be auditory, it could be a combination of both, it could be paper-based, it could be digital-based, or both. It could be a recording, either digital, video, or audio for students to refer back to, but getting information to learners in multiple ways. And the thing I want to say there is, as long as it's accessible. So providing a paper worksheet, for example, and then taking a picture of that paper worksheet with your iPad and allowing students to access that digitally is not really presenting it in multiple and flexible ways. I mean, it kind of is digital versus paper, but that picture of the worksheet is not real text. It's a picture of text, which means it's not accessible to somebody who can't see it or can't read it. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about presenting things in multiple ways. Some guidelines, checkpoints here. We've talked about culture and the culture of the environment and students' backgrounds. And are there barriers? Are there things they don't understand? I had a teacher once in Florida tell me, and this particular school was about half an hour, 45 minutes from the ocean. And this teacher was teaching a biology lesson about ecosystems. And he was referring to the ocean and the beach and how things look and feel and smell. And even though this was, less than 45 minutes from the ocean, the school, the majority of the students had never been to the beach, and they just were not on board with what he was doing and weren't getting the questions right. And he finally stopped and said, all right, how many of you have never been to the beach? And it was more than half the class. And so those sorts of assumptions, although usually perfectly innocent, present real barriers to learning. And I tell people, when you go take your car in to get fixed and you are not a transmission expert, and that transmission expert does come out and start talking to you, as soon as he or she starts to use like 2 or 3 terms related to transmissions that you're not familiar with, you check out and you're just like, yeah, okay, go do it. Same thing in classrooms. I'll actually go back real quick. I just want to talk about that last bullet point. Can students customize the receipt of information? So that's a big one. So it might depend on the day, on the task, on the content itself, as to how students choose to receive that information. So for example, can they choose today to receive it on paper? Can they choose in class tomorrow to receive it digitally? And the option to change that is pretty important. Okay. So I want you to think about reading and how you would define reading. And then I want to talk about 3 different types of reading. So we've got visual reading, which is kind of, what we're used to. We have a piece of paper and we visually see it with our eyes. We take that information in through our eyes. We phonetically decode. We put ideas and concepts together and assimilate it with what we've already got going on in here. And that's probably how most of us would define visual reading, as opposed to tactile reading, which of course would be with your fingers, most likely, and would include things like Braille and large print, reading with your fingers, which takes a lot of practice and is very difficult. And then we've got auditory reading, and this might be new for some of you. And so this is reading with your ears. And I want you to start saying things like reading auditorily and reading with your ears rather than listening to a book. And here's why. Just like I can kind of look around, take in a lot of information with my eyes, that's very different than reading with my eyes. Just like I can hear a lot of things. If a book was playing, I can hear it. That's very different than reading that content with my ears for meaning, for comprehension, and which is actually very difficult and takes more working memory than reading with your eyes. It's also something that we don't teach explicitly. We don't teach kids how to read with their ears in most cases. And so just presenting an auditory book to a student is not the answer. It's also not a replacement for continuing to teach phonetic decoding and systematic reading. So these all three potentially could interact with each other. They're not mutually exclusive. Okay. So some tools and strategies for doing that. We've talked about, I think, a lot of these concepts. Turn on those subtitles in Google Slides, PowerPoint slides for sure. Even if you don't have slides to present per se, bring up an empty slide or just just a black slide, a white slide, and turn on the captions. Rewordify is a pretty cool tool. Read and Write for Google is also a lot of tools built into Read and Write for Google that include text to speech and speech to text and word prediction. And if you're showing videos in class, whether it's virtual class or face-to-face class, always have those captions turned on as well. Oh, classroom amplification systems. This is an important one and a pretty easy one, and one that benefits almost all students. And the research on that is super overwhelming. And if you're if you're in the process of doing a new building or a new learning environment and you have the opportunity to build in a classroom amplification system, probably amongst the top 3 to 5 things you could spend your money on. And if you are not a believer and would like to try it out, Patton's Lending Library has some classroom amplification systems of various types to loan you for free. We'll ship it to you. You try it for 6 weeks, take data on it, ship it back to us. We even pay for you to ship it back to us, so it truly costs you nothing. I think you'll be blown away. Not only do all students in the room receive information better with an amplification system, the teacher at the end of the day, almost 100% of the time, reports that he or she is less tired, because they can just talk normally the whole day and everybody hears it the same way. Okay.
Any other ideas you want to add to the chat about multiple means of representation? Anything that you'd be interested in trying, something you're not doing? While you're typing, we're going to head to the next one and just add any questions that you might have into the chat as well.
We know this is a lot of information real quick. And so just keep in mind that Marcy and I are not going anywhere. I mean, we are leaving this Zoom eventually, but we're still available to answer questions. Reach out, send emails, call us, put stuff on the Padlet. We're happy to help. Yeah, definitely, Susan. Reach out. We can try to get that narrowed down and get you some specific things to try.
Absolutely.
So how students respond to you and play with information in their brains and get it back out to you to demonstrate their understanding of content happens in the strategic network, and it's the output, it's the action and expression. So do you have options available? Is it just wooden pencils and paper laying around, or is the option to walk over there to that basket and get a pen? Can they come over here and grab a device to type onto? Do they have choice? Can I do it with a pen today and do it on a keyboard tomorrow? And if it doesn't matter, then they should have that choice. If you're not measuring their ability to type on a keyboard, then it doesn't matter if they do it with a pen or with a pencil or however else. If you're not measuring the readability of their handwriting, then it shouldn't matter how they get that response to you. So be constantly cognizant of what it is that you're assessing in any given moment. Okay, and keep in mind executive functioning issues. So sometimes it's not that a student can't or is unwilling or doesn't have the skills to accomplish a task. It's that the executive functioning to organize it and put it in a process that makes sense and not overwhelming just isn't there. And there's some real quick, easy ways to fix that a lot of times. And we all experience the same thing. And so if you're a list maker, that's a perfect example. If the first thing you do is check your calendar in the day and then make lists and organize and prioritize, those are executive functioning types of things that our students sometimes need some assistance with. And different ways for them to respond. Here's just some more creative ideas. You guys were already on the right track with allowing typing versus, handwriting and things like that. But use things like Plickers and Kahoot, comics, allow them to create comics. And sometimes there's comics that are already sort of designed and students can just fill in the bubbles with their own words, which some students are super engaged with. Use things like social media. I like the idea of Twitter, and I don't tweet a whole lot except on Tuesday nights. We've got a Tuesday night Twitter chat at 8:30. But I like the idea of using Twitter as sort of a mini blog almost, in that students are forced to fit their ideas in a condensed 240 or 280 characters, whatever it is, which is hard to do. And you think it's, it's going to be an easier task because it's such a short piece of writing. But what it forces students to do sometimes is really condense their writing into something that's concise and makes sense and doesn't have a whole lot of jargon and things like that in it. And yeah, Twitter is a great tool for bite-sized professional development for staff. So yeah, Tuesday nights, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time to 9 o'clock, just for half an hour. Every Tuesday night, we do a Twitter chat on these types of topics. Definitely show up, connect with other Indiana educators, other educators across the United States, sometimes international. All right, we can move on. This is just a quick demonstration of Apple clips that I talked about earlier.
Hi, my name is Nola Thompson. Today, our thing is division. Our division problem is 9 divided by 3. 9 minus 3 equals 6. 6 minus 3 equals 3. 3 minus 3 equals 0. How many times did you subtract 3? 3 times. So 9 divided by 3 equals 3. We got it.
All right, so I love that clip. I think that's a great one to show how engaged students can be. Rather than filling out a worksheet, she was definitely able to justify her answer and really get down to why the answer was 3 and show you some concrete examples of that. And she had fun with it. She gave herself a little clap at the end, which I love. Do you have anything to add to that, Daniel, before I go on?
Well, just one thing real quick, which I think will lead right into what you're going to say next. I hope anyway. That's a really cool little demonstration of that tool. But also for that particular tool, that student may or may not have required some specific instruction on how to use that tool. I mean, there's different buttons, things that have to be done in a certain order. And sometimes what's required for a student with a disability to do that is that specific instruction and support on how to use the tool itself, which should be done separately from working on the content. And what that adult's going to do is the specially designed instruction, right, Marcy?
Absolutely. So we talked about what's good for all kids, and that's universal design for learning. Those are the 3 principles that Daniel just went over. And now we're going to talk about, in the last few minutes that we have, what is required for students with disabilities. What do we have to do? What are we legally obligated to do for our students with disabilities? And that's that specially designed instruction piece. And it really is adapting or changing the content, the methodology, or the delivery of instruction to really address the barriers that are due to this child's disability and make sure that they have access regardless of those barriers that are in place because of their disability. So how are we going to do that, and what does that mean? Remember, this is what makes special education special and what the teacher needs to do in order to assist the student. And specially designed instruction can be in all of these areas. So think about any of a student's opportunity for growth or area of need. It can be academic, it can be reading, writing, math. Daniel talked about executive functioning. That is something that we need to train our students on if that's a skill deficit for them. It can be behavior. It can be managing emotions. It can be their communication needs. How do they utilize that device or those picture tools in order to help them communicate? What are their sensory needs? When we talk about students and what their future is going to look like, how are we training them for the vocational skills that they might need? And then, as Daniel just said, that technology piece. How are we going to instruct them to utilize the technology that we're giving them that can allow them access to that curriculum? So any of these areas can be what that specially designed instructions around. And think of their goals in their IEP and how we're going to help them reach the goals that we have set in place for them. So there's various types of specially designed instruction that we can provide. There's packages or comprehensive programs that we can utilize, but it doesn't have to be that. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with OG or Orton Gillingham or Read 180 or TouchMath. All of these are great programs, and they all have a research base around assisting students and some specific around assisting students with disabilities and various eligibility categories. So programs are definitely something to look into, but that's not the end all be all, and you don't have to have a program to provide specially designed instruction for our students. Other options are just instructional techniques or strategies. So various learning strategies that you have, offering various formats, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile instruction, which to me is just really good teaching. We're going to talk about what makes that SDI on the next slide. Integrated practices, pauses during instruction, making sure that you're giving enough wait time after you pose questions, maybe even having clear task analysis for students, breaking down those larger tasks into smaller, more doable parts. Short, concise directions. Sometimes we might add visuals to the directions. We might have a click play button where they can auditorily hear the directions or auditorily read, as Daniel would say. Increased instructional intensity. So students who need more practice, more steps, more review. And all of these things can help all students, but they're what we have to do for students with disabilities. And the have to comes along with being aligned to their present levels. Is it what we said we were going to do? Does it meet them where they're at within the IEP and what their present levels of performance is saying? Are they designed, aligned with their goals? Is it research or evidence-based specific to their disability? So if it's a student with a specific learning disability, are we providing instruction to them on an evidence-based practice for students with specific learning disability? And do we know that evidence base behind the instructional strategies that we're utilizing? Teacher-led, notice it doesn't say special education teacher-led. Any teacher can provide specially designed instruction, but it is designed by the special ed teacher and the case conference committee in that meeting to determine what instruction is needed in order for the student to meet the goals. Is it systematic? So when we're thinking about it's planned based on the data in the present levels, it's delivered over time, it's documented, and it's evaluated based on data. So when we're talking about just good teaching and how some of these practices of specially designed instruction is good teaching, we have to go back to the research base for students with disabilities, that it's planned based on the specific data for that student, and we're documenting that. And it's not just a one and done. We're not just randomly providing this in a visual way on a random Tuesday, but over time, we are providing this instruction to students. There is a question in the chat. Thank you for sharing. Oh, sorry. That was Daniel. Jill, that's for you. Apologize. Addressing the learning of other deficits that prevent the student from reaching the grade level standard. So what are those barriers that are in place due to the student's disability? And is this instruction going to allow them to go around that barrier or over that barrier in order to have access to the curriculum? And then we have to think about, is this instruction going to be able to transfer the skill and generalize into different areas of instruction? So that is what makes it SDI. So always know what the student's current level of functioning is, what is in place, or what's the research behind the instruction that you're doing. Make sure that you're doing it on a regular basis and that it's documented. And then how are we going to ensure that they're meeting their goals? Looking at that data over time, what's that progress monitoring data show? Is it working? Is it not working? Do we need to adjust? So another thing that's required in addition to specially designed instruction are providing those accommodations and modifications that are needed for our students. Accommodations are really looking at the how a child learns and accesses the curriculum. So it's not changing what the student is doing or changing the expectation or the complexity or the grade level, but it's changing how they access that curriculum. So sometimes when we talk about accommodations, we're looking at, okay, is a student going to utilize a calculator for that? Maybe it's not assessing computation and they're going to utilize a calculator, or maybe they have extended time. What they're doing doesn't change, but they have a greater period of time to complete the task that they're doing. Sometimes it gets a little tricky when we're talking about accommodations and modifications. So one of the best examples that I have to kind of help teachers wrap their brain around the difference between the two is talking about a math worksheet. Maybe there's 20 problems on this math worksheet and you reduce the length of the assignment because it takes the student longer to complete the assignment. And you say, okay, go ahead and just do the first 5. But if I, as a student, only do the first 5, and out of the 20 problems on that worksheet, there are 4 concepts that are covered, and I'm only completing the first concept, that is changing the what. That's changing the complexity. So rather than the first 5 on the worksheet, maybe you complete the first 2, and then you can complete 6 and 8, and then you complete 10 and 12, or whatever it may be, in order to ensure that you are covering all of the content. Because you can reduce assignments as an accommodation, but you need to make sure that all of the concepts within the lesson are still being covered when we're accommodating for students. So it's a change in the how, not a change in the what or the complexity of what we're doing. Any questions around specially designed instruction or accommodations and modifications?
I'll just add real quick. I was going to type it, but I might as well just say it. Perfectly said about accommodations and modifications. Really well put. And I'd just like to add that the implication of modifying, which is, so modifying really is taking a state standard, a target, an objective, and changing it. And so when we start to do that to students, the ultimate implication of that is removing students from diploma track. And so that's a serious implication. Accommodations, on the other hand, keep students focused on that state standard.
Absolutely. All right, so we have a couple minutes left, just enough time to do this quick activity. So consider what Daniel's talked about, universal design for learning, and what I've talked about under specially designed instruction. And as we watch this video, I want you to think about how this teacher is meeting the needs of all the learners within her classroom. So as we're watching it, go ahead and just jot down in the chat how she's meeting the needs of all the learners.
That is an opinion, but Daniel gets to share his.
I'm a word person. I feel great when we're all reading and discussing and writing papers. That feels super comfortable to me. But it's not successful for all my students, so I need to disrupt that for myself.
Now, right before we sample it, Mick, tell everybody what is it that you need to be able to do by the end of class today?
I can describe the process of milk turning into yogurt through fermentation.
Okay, here is a job that I need. I need every person in this room to get a plastic cup.
Within any single day, you'll have a variety of access points for the content, and I do find that it deepens engagement for gen ed kids, for special education kids, for all different kinds of students, because there's more to do. Like, we gotta keep it moving, otherwise it gets really boring. So it's trying to find a way where there's something that's video, where there's something that's audio, where there's something that's visual, where there's something that's read. It is about that many paths, many paths.
Floating around, nobody's connected to anybody else, floating around, we're floating around. Now make 1 milk protein. 1 milk protein.
I really learned how important it was to introduce more visual cues for my students who are English language learners, where you do an action related to vocabulary or related to a concept.
We're going to stretch out, stretch out, stretch.
The learning gains that I saw for my ELL learners were so huge when I started to disrupt a purely language-based and word-based type of instruction.
But what do I want now? Connect. Connect. Connect.
It matters less to me how we arrive somewhere. What matters to me is that a student develops the conceptual understanding around something.
Get tiny, get tight, get small. You're a tiny, tight little milk protein.
I just saw my students really be able to shine. It was beautiful to watch.
Okay. And class.
All right, so in the chat, we have some tactile movement, reading, doing, movement and actions to engage students. Nice. So many different ways in order to meet the needs of learners within the classroom. And I love the saying, what is critical for some is beneficial for all. And I think we need to think back of that. What we have to do for students with disabilities, for EL learners, what we have to do for students who are more at risk. And when we provide that instruction to all students benefit. Think of how many students, when they take that assessment, are being a little milk protein and doing the movements before they either jot it down, or maybe that is the assessment, just them showing and being able to explain that via video. Always go back to that learning target and what we're assessing, and how are students able to show what they know, and how are we able to assess their learning, regardless of paper pencil activity or movement or video or any different way. So again, the learning targets are so important. Some more messages coming up, variety of modalities, engaging all the learners in a variety of ways. Let the student keep his hat on. Absolutely, pick your battles. Definitely. Really quick, and I know we're really close on time, but noting that Twitter is good PD for people, I ran across another teacher's page, and kids were constantly had their hoods up, and she's like, normally I wouldn't fight that battle, but they had hoods up and masks on, and she's like, all I could see was like barely their eyes, and it was really hard to gauge, one, whether they were engaged, but two, whether they were able to, understand the information that was being provided. And come to find out, when she had conversations with the students and opened that line of communication with them around the why behind them wearing the hats, it's because they didn't like their hair that day and they didn't like their cut. Now she has a corner of her room that has like combs and product and all of these things available for students to be able to come in early in the morning and do their hair. And it has completely changed the environment within the classroom. Students are helping other students, so they're just more comfortable. But that's, again, creating that culture of safety within the room where they were able to communicate that to her. But yes, definitely pick your battles when it comes to that, and support students in the why. Why is it happening? We do have some additional resources. So there's the Patton's UDL lesson planner that's available to you to use. Daniel, do you want to touch on this really quickly?
Yeah, sure. So this is a very comprehensive lesson creator that's done using Google Forms. So nothing fancy, but it does cover all of the potential aspects of creating a lesson that's truly universally designed. So it could be a daily lesson, a weekly unit, or a monthly unit, however you want to do it. And because it's so comprehensive, I tell teachers it's not one that you're going to use for every lesson plan, but it's a great idea to do it once or twice a year. And if you're an administrator, have your staff do it once a year, and just to kind of make them think through all of the components and aspects of something that's truly universally designed. And it's free. And you end up with a Google Doc version of your lesson plan that you're free to keep and edit forever.
And like Daniel said, this isn't something you're going to use all the time, but think back to your college days, or we have a student on as well, and think about how you had to write the extensive step-by-step lesson plan, as teacher said, students said, just to get you in the mindset of thinking about planning for a lesson. And I think when you do this a couple times, it does change the questions that you ask yourself as you're designing. So it's definitely something good to have at the side and some experience with, so that when you are doing your regular lesson plans, at least those considerations are in the back of your mind.
Marcy, Susan's got a good question, but maybe something we can work with her individually on.
Yeah, absolutely, Susan. We can follow up with you after this. Feel free to email either one of us and we'd be happy to help you.
So just real quick, the ICAM, the Indiana Center for Accessible Materials, is part of the Patents Project, and that's where the specialized formats or the accessible educational materials of textbooks come from. And not only textbooks, but we are now adding pleasure reading books, novel type books in accessible formats. So Braille, large text, digital text, audio, accessible EPUBs, PDFs, all at no charge to Indiana schools. I talked about our lending library. Feel free to borrow stuff from us. It's free. Take data on it, see how it works. I think we talked about a lot of these things already.
And you'll have access to these slides as well. Sorry, we're going to have to skip over the video. But I think this is really important. Do your best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And I think that's what this is all about. Like if you've not done it in the past, but today you learned something new, maybe that's something that you can start in your classroom and you can do better.
Make it one little thing, one little thing. Don't completely throw out everything you're doing. Pick one little thing of what you're already doing and just change one aspect of it. Maybe offer another way to present it, another way for students to respond, and just see how that goes for a few days.
Absolutely. All right. We are definitely over our time per the usual with Daniel and me. But what I would like for you to do, please go ahead and fill out an evaluation for today's session. We are always trying to better meet the needs of all the educators across the state. So tell us what we're doing well, tell us what we need to improve upon, and we will work to ensure that we do that. I'm going to add the chat, I'm going to add this link to the chat so that you have it and you can just simply click on it. There will be a drop down where you select today's session. So please be sure that you're evaluating this session today. And somebody did ask about certificates earlier. Yes, we will be emailing certificates that reflect professional growth points for today's session. All right, and again, Susan, email us. Daniel put his email in the chat. They're also here on this slide. And please let us know how we can assist in any way. We appreciate you guys. Thanks for all that you do for our students. Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody.